Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I want to thank the Munich Security Conference for inviting me to speak this morning. Ambassador Issenger, it's great to see you put on a great event as you and I talked last night, reminisced. I remember it, my first one 20 years ago as Verkunda. I think I was stuffed in a back room somewhere for the duration, but it was a fantastic event. At that time, we had maybe a dozen members of the United States Congress, and today I think we have nearly 50. And I think it's a great demonstration of the bipartisanship in the United States Congress and the interest they have in important matters of foreign policy. I also want to thank the German government in Munich for hosting us. As some of you may know, I was a young Army officer many years ago assigned to Italy. My unit, airborne unit, used to come frequently to Germany and train in Hohenfels and Grafenfehr and Wilflicken and Wilsik. I got to know the German people well. And I used to bring my family here, and my young son, who was also born in Europe, we used to bring him up, and he used to run around the square, the plaza, beneath the Glockenspiel and chase the birds. So it's always great to come back to this wonderful city and to see the wonderful people that are here. So I'd like to speak to you today about the number one priority of the United States Department of Defense, implementing the National Defense Strategy. The NDS states that we are now in an era of great power competition, with our principal challengers being China, then Russia, and that we must shift our focus away from low-intensity conflict and prepare once again for high-intensity warfare. At the same time, it recognizes that our second-tier priorities are rogue states such as North Korea and Iran. And finally, dealing with violent extremist organizations will likely be an enduring threat for years to come. Being in Europe, I know that there has been much discussion about the challenges from Russia. So this morning, I want to focus on the Pentagon's top concern, the People's Republic of China. Next year will mark the 20th anniversary of a decision that fundamentally altered the course of international affairs, China's admission into the World Trade Organization. I was working in the United States Senate at the time, and two competing arguments over China's membership dominated the public debate. The prevailing notion of the day was that if we allowed the PRC into the WTO and other multilateral institutions, China would continue on its path of economic reform and eventually become a market-oriented trading partner. More broadly, increased engagement with the liberal world order would also spur political opening and help transform the PRC into a responsible global stakeholder. And who knows, maybe even a democracy one day. The more skeptical voices argued that if granted membership, China would use the benefits of free trade and open international order to grow its economy and access technology required to build a strong military and security state capable of expanding the reach of its authoritarian rule. These were both credible arguments, but we all know which one is winning right now. It's not the former. In fact, under President Xi's rule, the Chinese Communist Party is heading even faster and further in the wrong direction. More internal repression, more predatory economic practices, more heavy-handedness, and most concerning for me, a more aggressive military posture. It is essential that we, as an international community, wake up to the challenges presented by China's manipulation of the long-standing international rules-based order that has benefited all of us for many decades. The Communist Party and its associated organs, including the People's Liberation Army, are increasingly operating in theaters outside its borders, including Europe, and seeking advantage by any means and at any cost. Let me state up front, though, the United States does not seek conflict with China. In fact, we look for areas of cooperation when our interests converge in the hope that they will choose the other path that they didn't select 2 decades ago. Just look at the nearly 18 tons of medical supplies the United States recently provided to the PRC to help fight the coronavirus. And last week, we announced more than $100 million in assistance to China and other countries affected by that malady. The world is too interconnected for us not to work together to solve some of our toughest problems. However, to be a responsible member of the international community, China must be transparent and respect the sovereignty, freedom, and rights of all nations. Unfortunately, their current behavior leaves great cause for concern. The United States National Defense Strategy recognizes this critical challenge as we adapt and prepare our forces to deal with China in this new era of great power competition. The PRC's growing economic, military, and diplomatic power often manifests itself in ways that are threatening, coercive, and counter to the rules-based international order. Over time, we have watched them seize and militarize islands in the South China Sea and rapidly modernize their armed forces while seeking to use emerging technologies to alter the landscape of power and reshape the world in their favor, and often at the expense of others. I continue to stress to my friends in Europe, just as I did this past week at the NATO Defense Ministerials Conference in Brussels, that America's concerns about Beijing's commercial and military expansion should be their concerns as well. This September will mark the 75th commemoration of the end of World War II and the birth of the international rules-based order that has supported security and prosperity around the globe. The United States, our NATO allies, and partners across the Indo-Pacific have sacrificed blood and treasure over the decades to protect and preserve it. Yet the PRC seeks to undermine and subvert the system, the same one that allowed them to rise and become what they are today. As we speak, Communist China is exerting financial and political pressure publicly and privately on many Indo-Pacific and European nations, large and small, while pursuing new strategic relationships worldwide. In fact, the smaller the country, the heavier the hand of Beijing. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, for example, the PRC is leveraging its overseas investments to force other nations into suboptimal security decisions. This has wide-reaching ramifications for the United States and our allies in critical areas like data security, interoperability, and military readiness. While we often doubt the transparency and forthrightness of Beijing, when it comes to their security aims, we should take the Chinese government at their word. They have said that by 2035, the PRC intends to complete its military modernization, and by 2049, it seeks to dominate Asia as the preeminent global military power. Furthermore, the global community should be deeply concerned about the party's use of artificial intelligence and other technologies to surveil and repress Muslim minorities, journalists, pro-democracy protesters, and others. To make matters worse, the government is now exporting those tools worldwide in a manner that could bolster other authoritarian regimes. China's rapid ascent has stirred much debate over the primacy of the United States and the West in the 21st century. I understand this topic is part of this year's Munich Security Conference report. China's growth over the years has been remarkable, but in many ways it is fueled by theft and coercion and exploitation of free market economies, private companies, and colleges and universities. American and European institutions and corporations face the brunt of these malign activities, and we have often seen a multitude of examples where our economies and our companies have suffered as a result. But Beijing's bad behavior, will only take them so far. The world is increasingly aware of its motives and responding in turn. Regrettably, rather than change course, party leadership continues its rampant technology theft, while resolving to eventually end its reliance on foreign innovation altogether, then independently develop its own systems, and then dominate critical sectors and markets. Huawei and 5G are today's poster child for this nefarious strategy. History has proven time and again, though, that authoritarianism breeds corruption, promotes conformity, smothers free thinking, and suppresses freedom. In stark contrast to this are our values, a sense of fairness and a culture of opportunity which encourages disruption and unleashes the very best of human intellect, spirit, and innovation. This is why it is critical that together we, all of us, directly and unambiguously address Beijing's actions and intentions so that we are never intimidated or duped or pushed into bad security, economic, or political choices. And maybe, just maybe, we can get them on the right path. Again, make no mistake, we do not seek conflict with China. It's not what we want, not at all. Rather, we seek fair and open competition in the economic realm, And in general, we simply ask of Beijing what we ask of every nation: to play by the rules, to abide by international norms, and to respect the rights and sovereignty of others. To restore an equal footing, the Department of Defense is doing its share. We are focused on deterring bad behavior, reassuring our friends and allies, and defending the global commons. And to maintain the peace through strength, we are implementing the United States National Defense Strategy. As part of this strategy, we're doing our part to safeguard American innovation and to reinvigorate our industrial base. Thanks to our largest research and development budget in 70 years, we are investing in cutting-edge technologies and accelerating the modernization of our force, while at the same time divesting from legacy systems and reinvesting those savings into hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and many other game-changing technologies. Unlike China and others, we will use these advanced capabilities to keep the peace, to promote prosperity, to ensure security, and to protect the sovereignty of all freedom-loving countries. For example, while Beijing uses AI to tighten its grip over its people, the Department of Defense has established well-regarded principles for the lawful and ethical use of AI. While the PRC develops and deploys long-range fires to intimidate and threaten its neighbors, we are investing in both conventional and advanced missile defense systems to protect the homeland, our interests, and our allies. And while Communist China is weaponizing the space domain through the development of directed energy weapons and killer satellites, the Pentagon is standing up its first new military service in over 70 years, the United States Space Force, to ensure freedom of use, freedom of commerce, and freedom of navigation into and through space for all. Simply put, the contrast between China's actions and United States leadership couldn't be more obvious. At the same time, we are protecting these high-tech breakthroughs from theft and exploitation by strengthening our foreign investment laws, supply chains, export controls, university-based research, and cyber defenses, all of which have been long-standing attack points of the Chinese government. We are encouraged that our allies and partners are beginning to take similar actions as they thoroughly assess the long-term threats and challenges posed by China. Among these concerns is a dependence on emerging technologies that could inject serious risk into our defense cooperation. Reliance on Chinese 5G vendors, for example, could render our partners' critical systems vulnerable to disruption, manipulation, and espionage. It could also jeopardize our communications and intelligence sharing capabilities, and by extension, it could jeopardize our alliances. To counter this, we are encouraging allied and U.S. tech companies to develop alternative 5G solutions, and we are working alongside them to test these technologies at our military bases as we speak. In the long run, developing our own secure 5G networks will far outweigh any perceived gains from partnering with heavily subsidized Chinese providers that ultimately answer to party leadership. In short, let's be smart. Let's learn from the past. And let's get 5G right so we don't regret our decisions later. The reality of the 21st century is that many economic decisions are also national security decisions. We are not asking our partners to reject engagement with China. Just the opposite. We want you to show them the right path, and we want you to nudge them down it. In the meantime, though, we are asking our friends to clearly choose a global system, the global system, that supports democracy, protects human rights, and safeguards our greatest asymmetric advantages, our values, our shared interests, and our unmatched network of alliances and partnerships. We feel that the choice is clear, but recognize it may be tough, that the economic challenges may take a toll in the short run, but that our collective future may hang in the balance if we fail to make the hard choices now for the long run. The United States does not want an adversarial relationship with China. It's a great country with an extraordinary history, a rich culture, and a wonderful people. Rather, we want China to behave like a normal country that adheres to the international rules and order that generations before us have fought hard to protect and preserve. And that means the Chinese government. The government needs to change its policies and behaviors. If the PRC will not change its ways, then defending the system must be our collective priority. We can only do this by making greater investments in our common defense, by making the hard economic and commercial choices needed to prioritize our shared security. and by working together to maintain a ready and capable alliance network that is prepared to deter any threat, to defend any ally, and to defeat any foe. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to our questions.
Please take a seat.
You're mic'd. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, once again, we are running out of time for questions, but I shan't let the opportunity go by to fall back on my NATO beat. Mr. Secretary, you were just here in Brussels with us. And I would like to know if we have any more details now about the reduction of violence. When is this period going to start? Do we have any more precision on that? And also, what is the U.S. government doing to bring in the Afghan government on this? I had heard there may be even some meetings between U.S. government officials and President Ghani here at this meeting, and also on Iraq. You are asking NATO allies to do more with the coalition, to take over some tasks being filled by the U.S. right now, so that may free you up for other jobs. How have the NATO allies responded? What exactly are you asking them to do? How is that going?
Well, let's start with Afghanistan.
Thank you.
So we have on the table right now a reduction in violence proposal that was negotiated between our ambassador and the Taliban. It looks very promising. We have now been for a few days now in the process of consulting, first with our Congress. I've had many conversations. And then secondly, concurrently, with our NATO allies in Brussels. We had 2 good days of consultation, well led by Secretary General Stoltenberg, who, by the way, is doing an exceptional job. I think there's general agreement, it's my view as well, that we have to give peace a chance, that the best, if not only way forward in Afghanistan is through a political agreement. And that means taking some risk. That means enabling our diplomats. And that means working together with our partners and allies on the ground to effect such a thing. Now, yesterday, Secretary Pompeo and I met with President Ghani. We had at least an hour-long discussion with him. I think he is fully on board. He wants to lead his part of the process, which, if we get to that, would be a peace deal that would involve very soon afterward an inter-Afghan negotiation. He wants to be clearly a full partner in that and wants to lead on that and make sure that all Afghans come together, are well representative, and can come up with an agreement that would endure so that we could end this long conflict and make sure that Afghanistan stays on the right path.
And on Iraq and the coalition, do you know more details on what tasks NATO allies may be willing to take over?
So we had a good discussion also with our NATO partners. As you know, the proposal on the table that was agreed to in principle, that NATO would pick up more of a mandate, would be willing to put additional forces into Iraq as part of our NATO mission Iraq. That would allow NATO to pick up more slack, if you will, and to address that mission in a way that we continue the 2 most important things we're trying to do in Iraq as a coalition and as an alliance. First, continue the enduring defeat of ISIS. And by the way, yesterday, I and the German defense minister hosted 82 countries, organizations. We keep adding partners to this coalition, all committed to the enduring defeat of ISIS, and that's very important. The second task we have in Iraq is to train, advise, and assist the Iraqi security services so that over time they could pick up in total that mission and ensure that ISIS does not come back and present the challenge it does to Iraq in particular, but the region more broadly.
Secretary Esper, let me take you back to the main theme of your intervention, China. You mentioned Huawei. Now, there has been a very extensive, very complex campaign on behalf of the Trump administration engaging with allies on this issue. But it does not seem to be working because key NATO allies in Europe, Britain, France, Germany, are seemingly not going to exclude Huawei from building their 5G networks. I mean, I think members of your administration have said that this will have consequences. Could you tell me what kind of consequences will this have? And will you reconsider the strategy on this issue?
This past week was probably my 3rd or 4th defense ministerial at NATO in Brussels. At each time I've gone, we've discussed this issue. When I first got there in June, We had a wide spectrum of views on this issue. I can tell you that countries have moved. You have some countries who clearly understand the threat, the challenges. You have some in between, and you have some, on the other hand, who don't recognize the threats. I think that if you look around the globe, the United States clearly understands at this point in time. I think it's a shared bipartisan view in Washington of the threats and challenges posed by China in general and Huawei in particular. It took us some years to get to that understanding, and I think Europe is a little bit behind us. And I think over time, as we are able to share information and intelligence and work with one another, we will get there. The consequences are this, and I've made them clear in my remarks. If we don't understand the threat and we don't do something about it, at the end of the day, it could compromise what is the most successful military alliance in history, NATO, something that we are deeply invested in, something that I, as a young soldier, served in here in Europe as an officer, and we can't lose that. We can't lose that ability to share information, to exchange intelligence, to discuss operational plans, because we fear that our networks are compromised. That is the consequence we face, at least the foremost one for me as Secretary of Defense, as we look at this growing challenge.
But Secretary, even Britain, member of the Five Eyes, they have a very sophisticated capability to detect threats like that. They've decided to go ahead with it. So, I mean, what specifically do you think will be the consequences of this? Will you stop sharing intel with the British, or will Huawei just build the networks in Europe and that's?
Well, we have to take a look at these each country's approaches and thinking one step at a time. I've yet been able to digest what the UK has proposed, and there's just because you want to take one step forward doesn't mean you can't take two steps backward. We have to work with them and understand. Of course, at the end of the day, we're going to have to assess what the threat is to our networks and to our ability to exchange information, and we want to continue that dialogue. Like I said, one of the challenges when you have a heavily subsidized company, Huawei, that is answers to the Chinese government, and that can use those subsidies to offer good technology at a very low price. That's very seductive. They can draw you in. That's the way a company gets market share. But you have to think about the long-term consequences, and that's what we're most concerned about, and that's what we keep talking to our partners around the world, whether it's Europe, Asia, you name it. This challenge is out there, and different countries have taken different stances on this, and I've had many private conversations where you'll hear that there's this competition within a government is happening. Some folks that very clearly see the threat, the challenge, and others don't because of what's economically on the table.
We have, excuse me, we have about 5 minutes. I'm going to ask one more question and then also take one from the audience. So please, whoever wants to ask a question, get ready to hop up. Secretary Esper, I asked this also of the Secretary General. Are you concerned that if things move ahead in Afghanistan and you are able to draw down troops, that you will not have full visibility out in the provinces, that you won't actually know if the Taliban is adhering to the deal because you don't have boots on the ground anymore, and you've also got ISIS there now. So how can you feel confident? How can you feel confident that you can pull back?
Well, I think
if you should get to that point.
I think Secretary General Stoltenberg made the same point. Nobody's right now calling for the complete removal of U.S. and coalition forces. U.S. forces will remain there as long as necessary to support our Afghan partners and allies. We are committed to continue both our material and financial support to the Afghan national defense and security forces. At the same time, any reduction in forces will be conditions-based. And I've had extensive conversations with my commanders, with General Miller. I've been to Afghanistan a few times. He is very confident that we'll have enough information, sufficient information, either through our own technical means, through other measures, through help with the Afghans, to understand exactly what is happening on the ground and to make sure that what the Taliban commits to do will be what they have done, and to make a decision at the right points every step forward to make sure that, again, conditions-based apply, and we're very careful and thoughtful as we move through this process.
And you're not worried about ISIS using it as a safe haven, since they have moved in during the time that you've been on the ground there?
Well, ironically, between coalition forces and the Taliban, we've done great damage to ISIS. They are a much more reduced and marginalized force. That said, we have to keep a careful eye on them. At the end of the day, the goal is this: make sure that Afghanistan never again becomes a safe haven for terrorists that can attack our countries. That's our commitment. That's our goal. Whether it's al-Qaeda or ISIS or somebody else, we are committed to doing that.
Got it. Thomas Ilves. former president of Estonia.
Could we please get a microphone?
Yeah, he probably doesn't need one.
Mr. Secretary, many of us in Europe agree that there are significant dangers with Huawei, and the U.S. for at least a year has been telling us do not use Huawei. Are you offering an alternative? Are you going to subsidize Nokia and Ericsson? I mean, what do we get? What is it that we should do other than not use Huawei?
Yeah. It's a great point. We obviously have to develop alternatives, right? We can't say do nothing and leave the space open. So these are the issues we're discussing within the United States government. DOD is doing its share. As I mentioned in remarks, what we're doing is hosting on a handful of our military bases. We're asking providers of 5G to come in. I have the ability to clear away any type of regulatory paperwork and obstacles so they can come in and test 5G systems on our bases to prototype and to see how quickly we can move forward. And we're fully working this hand in glove with our commercial vendors to make sure we can advance those technologies. But I think what you've raised are the things we've been discussing within our NATO ministerial meetings.
I'm actually looking for some national security women to raise their hand. We've got one.
Hand there.
Okay, this is our last question, please. Yes, ma'am. Oh, Natalie.
Many thanks. Natalie Tocci from the Institute for International Affairs. Coming back to Asia and China, beyond transatlantic dialogue, what would you like to see NATO do more in Asia and vis-à-vis China?
Well, I spoke in my remarks about being aware of the challenges that China faces in the long run. I think right now the most important thing for NATO is building NATO readiness. We had a very good meeting in London, the Leaders Summit, where we all agreed on what's called the NATO Readiness Initiative. We met our marks with regard to having 30 squadrons, 30 naval surface combatants, and 30 mechanized battalions ready to go within 30 days. That's very important to NATO's readiness. I think first and foremost, NATO should focus on the security of the continent, deterring Russian bad behavior, and unifying and making sure the alliance is ready at a moment's notice. And then beyond that, we've talked about expanding. We've talked about NATO Middle East. But at the same time, concurrently, we have to be aware of the long-term challenges presented by China. Right now, it's first and foremost would be what's happening in the economic and commercial realm. And then over time, as we think about China writ large, something, by the way, we agreed to in the Leaders Summit about the NATO taking an approach toward China, understanding the long-term challenge that presents.
May I have last question from China?
I am actually waiting for instructions on whether President Macron is standing behind us. Does anybody see him throwing daggers at me out here? Can we take one more question?
Quick question from China.
Yes, please.
Already had the
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Quick.
About China.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm from China, Wu Sichun. Mr. Secretary, in your remarks, you mentioned that United States don't seek to confront with China. Instead, the United States would seek to cooperate with China. Could you give us some examples where United States is really willing to work together with China? Thank you.
Concise.
Yeah, no, I think there are a number of areas. Look, you can look in the economic realm where we cooperate, in the diplomatic space. We cooperated together for many years with regard to counter-piracy off the African coast. I think there's much more we can do in terms of disaster relief and humanitarian affairs. But look, at the same time, we're working together, the United States, closely with many of its ASEAN Plus partners to make sure that China respects the EEZs and the fishing zones and the other territorial claims that are clearly within the bounds of international law in that part of the world. So those are other areas where we need to work with them, establishing a code of conduct for good behavior. So I think we need to explore and exploit as much as possible areas of cooperation between the United States and China, because I'm not willing to give up on them. I don't think the United States government is either. We've got to continue working with them. It's not an issue of China, it's an issue of the leadership, and make sure they recognize that we can all benefit. To use their term, win-win, we can have a win-win strategy if we just abide by the international rules and norms that have been set in place for decades and that have benefited all of us, and that respect human rights and respect sovereignty and respect all the things that we value as Western nations.
So we have to wrap it up. President Macron of France is going to fall to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for making time. This was great to have a conversation.